He's helped me in more ways than I can count because he's not only an author, he's not only a scholar, he's not only a scientist, he's a Christian brother and a friend with a heart for ministry. Would you join me in welcoming Alister McGrath?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a huge pleasure it is to be here, to be able to talk to you tonight about Richard Dawkins, C.S. Lewis, and the meaning of life. Why choose Richard Dawkins and C.S. Lewis? Well, they are very well-known figures, and they say very interesting things, but very different things. And therefore, why not get them to talk to each other? Something, by the way, they've never done for obvious reasons, but try to use them to open up some of the big questions. So I thought we'd just begin by saying, who are these people? Who's Richard Dawkins? Well, until his retirement, he was Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, and he's written a number of books. One of them, of course, which I studied as a scientist myself, was The Selfish Gene. But of course, as Mark has pointed out, the book for which he's probably best known is The God Delusion, published in 2006. So in many ways, this man is representing the atheist position. I would say he's probably one of the best-known atheist writers in the world. And obviously, I'm going to use him to set up the atheist position and try and enter into dialogue with it. And of course, the person I'm choosing to interact with is C.S. Lewis. And Lewis, again, many of you will know all about him. He was a professor of medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge, and his well-known books include, well, you can guess what they are, Mere Christianity and Surprised by Joy. And Lewis is very interesting for many ways. In many ways, he is the man who exemplifies a Christian approach to the intellectual life, to the life of faith. And what I'm going to do is try and ask, what would Lewis say to Dawkins? What would Dawkins say to Lewis? And in effect, use this as a way of opening up these big questions. Now, you won't be terribly surprised to know that I'm much closer to C.S. Lewis on these things than I am to Richard Dawkins. But I'm going to do something which I think perhaps people don't always do. I'm going to try and take Dawkins very seriously and say, look, he's saying something that maybe we need to respond to. I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that he raises. And these two men are interesting because they have very different life trajectories. And many of you will know that in the case of Richard Dawkins, he's an evolutionary biologist, but interestingly, he began as a sort of Anglican of sorts and gradually transitioned to atheism. So he's someone who in effect has moved from some kind of nominal link with Christianity to a rather aggressive atheist. But as you will know, of course, Lewis is quite the reverse. His speciality is classics and English, and as perhaps you don't know, Lewis moved from his childhood atheism to mere Christianity. At Oxford, he discovered Christianity quite late in life and began to embrace this as something that was intellectually exhilarating and something that really gave him motivation to live out his life. So these are the two people we'll be interacting with. And what I want to do is begin by asking this question. It's a question that Richard Dawkins poses quite aggressively, but it is a good question. And the question is simply, is faith reasonable? And of course, Lewis and Dawkins have come to this question from very different directions. And interestingly, we need to ask what sort of reasons moved them in this direction. Dawkins takes the view that you can only believe what can be proved by reason or by science. And that's a very important theme. And I want to take it seriously, but at the same time begin to ask, where does this take us? Lewis takes a very different position. Lewis's argument is that most of the really important things in life lie beyond either rational or scientific proof, but are not irrational for that reason. If that sounds a little bit cryptic, well, I hope that as we progress, you'll begin to see what these ideas are all about. So let's begin by looking at Richard Dawkins on faith. Dawkins, in effect, takes the view that faith is the sort of thing that religious people get caught up in, and in effect it involves shutting down the life of the mind altogether. Here's Dawkins on the definition of faith. Faith, he writes, means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. In other words, it's a refusal to think. It's closing down the mind. It's irrational. It is not interested in evidence. And he expresses this in a number of ways. For example, in the second edition of his Selfish Gene, he made the remark that faith is a kind of mental illness. I think I have to say that's rather an overstatement, but it does, I think, indicate that Dawkins is absolutely convinced that there is something wrong with people who believe in God. And he goes on in later life to write this. Faith, he writes, is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, unnecessary, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Now, I'm going to leave that quotation on the screen for a moment, because I want you to think about that and ask whether actually that is right. Dawkins is taking the view that if there's good supporting evidence for something, then in effect you are compelled to accept it. But in a moment I'm going to suggest to you that that is simply not an acceptable analysis of the scientific method, and I'll explain why. Because it seems to me that Dawkins in many ways is exemplifying a way of thinking which has become, if you like, characteristic of what we sometimes call the new atheism. Although this is now, I think, on the way out. We're talking about Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and of course Christopher Hitchens. And this idea is very influential. And basically we could summarize it, I think, in terms of what you see is what you get. The way things are evident, are visible, are disclosed by the natural sciences is the way things really are. There's nothing beyond that or behind that. Reality for Dawkins is limited to what reason and science can prove. Now again, I'm going to take this seriously, but I'm going to say to you that I think there are difficulties with this position. Is it right? Well, I think there is an issue here. Let's look at that quote again. Dawkins says, if there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. But here's the point I want to make. Evidence is open to multiple interpretations. And very often in science, as in the law, as in most areas of life, the evidence does not compel us to accept any specific conclusion. We have to draw a conclusion, make a judgment that of the various explanations, this one is the best. It's not something that we are compelled to accept, but something that we choose to accept because it seems to us this is a better explanation than that, even though we're not compelled to accept it. So this is very much an attitude you find in the age of reason, the Enlightenment. And Dawkins, interestingly, like so many in the New Atheism, seems to be wedded to this very 18th century way of thinking. And I want to suggest to you that Dawkins here fails to make a distinction between two very different ideas. The total absence of supporting evidence, his phrase, and the absence of totally supporting evidence, my phrase. And what I'm going to make to you is that the norm in science is that we don't have absolutely supporting evidence to allow us to draw conclusions in many areas of science. We have to say the best interpretation of the evidence seems to be this, but then there's a little footnote. But of course, this might be a skewed reading of the evidence. So let me give you an example. There are many cases where scientific evidence is supportive of several outcomes. Proof, in the sense of a 100% demonstration, is really limited to the domains of mathematics and logic. And in real life, which is where you and I are, very often you simply find that we are unable to achieve anything approaching rational certainty. To give you an example from the sciences, there is a debate going on, many of you will know about this, about the question, is there a single universe, or is there what's called a multiverse, a raft, or a bubble of universes? The evidence actually is ambiguous and can be interpreted in both ways. And Dawkins, I think, encounters difficulty here, because on his very naive reading of science, I'd want to suggest he has to say the evidence compels us to accept this or that. But in fact, the evidence is open to at least two interpretations, and it is a matter of judgment, dare I say, a matter of faith, which of these decisions you believe is the better. That doesn't fit this very simple positivist reading of science, which Dawkins seems to think is normative. And we must remember that science changes its mind about things, not because it's irrational, but simply because of this constant process of checking things out as new evidence becomes available, or better theoretical interpretations begin to emerge. So what the scientific community believes to be the best explanation today might not be seen in that way in 20 years' time. I'm afraid things are more complicated than Dawkins suggests. And again, we might think of cosmology as a very good example of the radical change in thinking that's gone on around us. If we'd been meeting 100 years ago, well, obviously not in this chapel, but on this site, shall we say, and we were talking about the origins of the universe, well, I have to say to you, we wouldn't be having that conversation. Because as I'll come back to later in this lecture, the scientific consensus a century ago is that the universe simply had always been here. There's a radical shift in the past century reminding us that science rightly keeps questions open and sometimes changes its mind and changes it radically. So I've talked about Dawkins. What about C.S. Lewis? C.S. Lewis wasn't a scientist, but he knew scientists, he thought about these things, and his views, I think, are really worth considering. Interestingly, Lewis describes himself as an empirical theist who came to faith through induction. What he means by that, I think, is that he began to see that Christianity gave a big picture of reality, which seemed to be much more reliable, much more satisfactory than the atheism he embraced as a younger man. But I want you to note that Lewis became a Christian because of his perception that it offered a better explanation of things than his atheism. And actually, that's my story as well, although I don't want to place myself in the same kind of category as C.S. Lewis. He's rather better than I am. But the point I'm trying to make is that for me, as for Lewis, atheism actually doesn't explain things very well, whereas Christianity has this explanatory capaciousness, this ability to be able to hold things together, to make connections, to bring things into focus that very often you don't find with atheism at all. Lewis began as an atheist. And it's interesting to ask why he was an atheist. And there are two reasons he gives: science and suffering. Science, because for Lewis, science, in effect, was the explanation of the world. There was no need to invoke God. In fact, if anything, scientific advance meant theistic retreat. That, in effect, the more science we knew, the less plausible the idea of God was. And suffering, because Lewis was convinced that if there were a God, then, in effect, God allowed suffering in the world. And Lewis's experience in the First World War, he served in the British Army and was wounded, made him think, how can there be a God? Look at this mess. Now, Lewis began to realize that it wasn't quite that simple. But I want to suggest to you those are real concerns. So where did Lewis go from here? Well, let me tell you. Lewis began to have doubts about both the cognitive and the existential adequacy of atheism. Let me explain what I mean. Lewis said, well, look, if there were a God, then, how on earth could we justify this suffering? But as an atheist, of course, he believed there was no God. So if there's no God, who can you blame for the enormous suffering of the First World War? You can't blame God because there's no God to blame. And so the only option is to say it's our fault. It's in effect a reflection of our utter stupidity and lack of moral vision. And Lewis found that disconcerting because in saying there is no God, he seemed to be saying at one and the same time, but human beings are really quite messed up. But more importantly, I think, Lewis began to realize that atheism might make some kind of logical sense, but it failed to address the deeper questions of the meaning of life, of what we're here for. And for Lewis in particular, it seemed to trap him in a rather dull, rationalist world without any beauty, without any role for the human imagination, without any role for the deepest human intuitions that there's more to life than what we see around us. And we see this in this splendid quote from Surprised by Joy, as Lewis describes the kind of pressures he experienced in moving from atheism gradually through belief in God to a full-blown Christianity. He writes, on the one side, there was a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. It's a very powerful phrase, a glib and shallow rationalism. He goes on, nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So Lewis's head was saying, there just can't be a God. But everything else screamed out, there is a better way of thinking. And that tension eventually led him to leave his atheism behind. And what Lewis began to realize, that Christianity was a big picture, which had to be evaluated by its ability to fit in what he observed in the world around him and what he experienced within him. And he expresses this in what I would say is a signature quotation, the final sentence of a lecture he gave at Oxford in the 1940s. And here it is. Many of you will recognize this. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And I want you to hold that image in your mind, because Lewis is a very visual thinker, a sun rising on a misty, dark landscape. And as it rises, the mist burns away, the shadows are dispelled, and you see things more clearly than you otherwise would. Now, sure, there are these things, the shadowlands, things that still puzzle us. But Lewis's point is that Christianity allows us to see things more clearly than we otherwise would. And therefore, for Lewis, what drew him to Christian faith to begin with was this sense it works. It makes sense of things. It makes sense of what I see in the world, including the capacity of science to make sense of things, but also his deepest intuitions within him, that there had to be more than what this world disclosed. So where do we go from here? What I'm going to do is take Dawkins with deadly seriousness. I'm going to look at this point head on. Dawkins, I think, is absolutely right to say we need to provide reasons for our beliefs. We can't just believe anything. There's got to be some kind of justification, some kind of reason, some kind of evidence that we are right in what we think. But, and this is a very big but, Dawkins is wrong to think that we can prove everything that we believe. And if I succeed in proving this point to your satisfaction, then everything in Dawkins's case simply unravels. So stay with me as I try to explore this point with you. There's a quote from a leading atheist philosopher who I think was rather wiser than Dawkins. There's an early sentence in Russell's History of Western Philosophy. Philosophy, he writes, helps us live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. It's a nice quote, but it's one I think Dawkins would find puzzling. Why do we have to live without certainty? Russell's answer is because that's the way things are. And that's the way I think things are as well. And I'm going to explain to you why this is. There's an Oxford academic called Sir Isaiah Berlin. And Berlin famously, a noted intellectual historian, philosopher, basically said, look, all of human beliefs belong in one of three categories. First of all, there were those that could be proved by empirical observation, science, if you like. Then there were those that could be established by logical deduction. And then there was a third category of things that couldn't be proved in either of these ways. And here is Isaiah Berlin's point. There aren't actually many things in the scientific and logical categories. But in the third category goes every social, political, moral, religious, anti-religious belief we have, because none of those can be proved to be right. And Berlin's point is that the more important a belief, the more difficulty we have in proving it. Only shallow truths can be proved. You and I live on the basis of beliefs which we can't prove to be true. And that is true of atheists as well. So let's just press home on this point. Terry Eagleton, a well-known British social philosopher, said, we hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. In simpler English, what he's saying is, look, we believe a lot of stuff which we can't prove, but nonetheless it's reasonable to believe. In other words, it's about being beyond reasonable doubt, not something that's been proved. So let's do a little thought experiment. Here is the experiment. It's very simple. I want you to imagine that you only accept ideas that can conclusively and decisively prove to be right. Okay? In other words, you are limiting your world to these ideas. What might they include? Well, here are some. I think you could accept that 2 and 2 make 4. I think you could also accept that the whole, W-H-O-L-E, is greater than the part. And a bit more technically, I think you could agree that the chemical formula for water is H2O. But I hope I hear you saying, so what? I mean, these are not going to give you a reason to get up in the morning. These are not going to give you the deep existential traction that you need. You cannot base your life on any of those 3 beliefs. They're useful, but that's about as far as it goes. Now, let's take this thought experiment further. Here are some ideas that you could not accept on the basis of Richard Dawkins' criteria. Okay, here we go. Any moral, political, or religious, or indeed anti-religious ideas. One of the greatest paradoxes of Richard Dawkins is that he uses criteria to evaluate other people's ideas that he does not apply to himself. And that's a very significant point. Dawkins is haunted, absolutely haunted, by his inability to prove that atheism is right. He can't do it. We all know that. When I myself left atheism behind and embraced Christianity, I was always clear I was leaving behind one faith and embracing another. Because although I believed there was no God, I knew I couldn't prove it. And that makes it a faith. Let's keep going. Also, life has a meaning. And its meaning is you fill in the gaps. You just can't say that because you can't prove that. Or again, here's something else. You cannot accept any notion of what is good or bad because, again, that goes beyond decisive proof. Or the belief that there is a God, or inconveniently for Richard Dawkins, the belief that there is not a God. Now, the point I'm emphasizing is that the beliefs that bring meaning to life lie beyond absolute proof. And the point I'm going to make to you is simply that's the way things are. The fact that I cannot prove there is a God does not mean that belief is irrational. It just means that human reason struggles to deal with these really big questions. And that's why I think Dawkins has actually developed a very superficial, inadequate understanding of how we arrive at our beliefs. Interestingly, I'm going to add one more item to that list, and that's Darwinism. Now, some of you will be surprised by that. Those of you who are biologists, I think, probably won't be surprised. But interestingly, what I'm saying to you is that Darwinism is a scientific theory and hence is provisional and open to correction in the light of theoretical advance or more evidence. And in making that point, I'm going to draw on a notable authority in this field, Richard Dawkins. Here's what he says. In 2003, so it's not an old quote, "We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition." And that's just good science. It's saying, look, we've got to accept provisionality of theories because that's how science works. We keep everything under review. We can't say this is sorted. It's always under review. So I'm beginning to say to you that I think what we're seeing is that life is a bit more complicated than Richard Dawkins allows. And we live in a world in which the things that really matter to us are things, in the end, we have to accept by faith. And faith is not some sort of degeneracy that's limited to religious people. It's the human condition, because we end up being unable to prove the core things that we believe, whether we are atheists or Christians, or in fact, just about anything. So let's keep going by looking at a second major theme. Does science disprove God? Now, clearly, Dawkins is very, very concise in this point. Science makes God unnecessary and incredible. That scientific explanations will always win out in the end, and therefore the progress of science always entails the retreat of faith. It's a very simple Enlightenment worldview, this inexorable transition away from religion towards science, and that for Dawkins is just self-evidently true. Science, he argues, proves its assertions, whereas religion just asserts them. So what do we say in response to that? Well, I think we might say this. What about Lewis? Well, Lewis makes a number of points, and I think these really need to be given very careful attention. Lewis is not anti-science, but he raises fair points about what we think about science. Science, he argues, is provisional. It's on a journey, and it hasn't reached its end. So this may be what we think scientifically now, but it may not be the same as what we thought scientifically in the past, and we don't know what will be thought scientifically in the future. And secondly, the process of induction, in other words, looking at evidence and trying to draw out what's pointing to, doesn't deliver the certainty that many seem to crave. Those who've read David Hume will know all about this point. And then his point, that Christianity is able to provide an intellectual framework that both makes sense of the scientific enterprise and its successes, but also helps us understand its limits. So there is a very interesting contradiction between these two thinkers at this point. There's a quote from a writer who you will not know, William Inge, who was Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral during the Second World War. And he's basically saying, look, rationalism doesn't get what God is all about. It's almost as if rationalism thinks that God is something in the world, whereas, of course, for faith, God is the foundation of everything. He writes, rationalism tries to find a place for God in its picture of the world, but God cannot be fitted into a diagram. He's rather the canvas on which the picture is painted, or the frame in which it's set. So let's go back to this point I mentioned earlier. Dawkins' belief that science inexorably erodes belief in God. Here's my thoughts on this. I think there would have been a period between about 1870 and about 1920 when you could have believed what Dawkins said. But things have changed. Since about 1920, we've begun to realize that cosmology actually is much more complex than earlier generations thought. And we also began to realize that rationality, in effect, the process which we say this is right and this is wrong, again, is rather more complex than we'd realized. We're moving away from the Enlightenment towards a more complex, unsettling understanding of things. And certainly, if we look at changes in cosmology since the First World War, let me give you, here's a scientific consensus before the First World War. This is from a writer whose name I'm afraid I would struggle to pronounce, and therefore I'll simply let you read it. But this distinguished Scandinavian writer wrote this bestseller in 1906 in which he summarized the scientific consensus as follows. The universe in its essence has always been what it is now. Matter, energy, and life have only varied as to shape and position in space. In other words, universe always there, end of discussion. But all of you will know that all this has changed. Hubble began to realize there are star systems beyond our own galaxy, that the universe is expanding. And of course, that raises the question, why is it expanding? What does that tell us about the history of the universe? Pointing, of course, to the consensus of today, that the universe came into being. Now, interestingly, atheist scientists didn't like this. And I'll explain why in a moment. But you all know that this Big Bang, in effect, talks about something I think we just find impossible to visualize. That in an astonishingly short time, the universe grew from a very small size through the size of a grapefruit to what we have today. I find it almost impossible to imagine that. But interestingly, atheist writers didn't like the idea of the Big Bang. For example, Fred Hoyle thought this idea sounded too religious, and therefore he developed a steady state model, which is basically, well, something may seem to appear here, but something's disappearing somewhere else. So in effect, it all balances out. Now, interesting, Steven Weinberg, who, as many of you will know, is quite aggressively atheist, back in 1967 at a conference at MIT, he wrote these words: the steady state theory is philosophically the most attractive theory because it least resembles the account given in Genesis. Now, that's not really good science as far as I'm concerned. However, Weinberg wisely added these words: it's a pity the steady state theory is contradicted by experiment. So you can see where that takes us. Let me tell you about this debate about God. In 1948, Bertrand Russell got into an argument on BBC radio with Frederick Copleston. And the debate was the question of God. And it was complex. It ranged over a whole range of topics like, do we need God to provide a basis for ethics? Well, Frederick Copleston, the Christian, got the better of that debate by far. But one element of this debate was, do we need God to explain the universe? And Russell's argument was, well, look, the universe has always been here. We don't need God to explain that. There is no need to invoke God at all. He won that debate. But since then, the science has changed. It's changed radically. As many of you will know, this debate was replayed 50 years later in 1998. This time, William Lane Craig got involved in a debate with Anthony Flew, who was then an atheist. And William Lane Craig pressed Anthony Flew. If the universe came into being, then either it did so by a process we don't understand, or it was caused to happen. How do you fit that into your atheism? And Flew experienced extreme intellectual discomfort with that argument. And as you will know, although I say he's an atheist, he rapidly became an ex-atheist, although he moved towards a kind of generalized theism of some kind. But the key point is, this debate has changed. This idea that somehow science is irreversibly moving against religious belief is simply not the case. And we need to make that point heard, I think. Now, there's another point, which is to do with Dawkins' understanding of science. Dawkins believes that a scientific explanation trumps everything. In other words, you provide a scientific explanation, every other explanation is thereby excluded because science is right, and there is no need to bring anything else into the equation. The question that Lewis would ask is, what if that's just part of the picture, not the total picture? In other words, in offering explanations of things, that science has something to say, but also so has religion. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to give you a very simple analogy. There is a kettle boiling, and this is Frank Rhodes, who was a British geologist who became president of Cornell University. And he asks us to imagine a kettle boiling. Here is his question: why is the kettle boiling? And he gives an answer. Because there is energy conversion. In his case, the gas catches fire, energy is converted, water reaches boiling point. That is why the kettle is boiling. But he also said, but of course there's a second reason, which is, he's English, I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Now, I want you to hold that in your head. Two explanations. Does the fact that explanation 1 is right mean that explanation 2 is wrong? No. Does the fact that explanation 2 is right mean that explanation 1 is wrong? No. The two explanations go together to give you a bigger, a more reliable picture of what was actually going on. He wanted a cup of tea, therefore he put the kettle on to boil, the gas was converted, and so on. You see the point I'm trying to make? We need a bigger picture, and science is part of the picture, but it's not all of the picture. And that really is Lewis's position. Here's Frank Rhodes just making this point. These, energy conversion, making a cup of tea, are different answers, but both are true, both are complementary, and not competitive. One is appropriate within one particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. And that's really what Lewis is saying. And I want to suggest to you that is right. That, we can quite easily talk about a scientific account of the origination of the universe, here's how it happened, and a religious account, here is why it happened, the whole doctrine of creation. One is about this is what actually unfolded in history. The other is this is why that process began to unfold in the first place. It is a bigger picture which brings together these insights, and that seems to me to be a very important point to make. Which brings me to my third and my final point. What's life all about? It's a very important point, And Dawkins and Lewis take very different perspectives on this. It's very easy, particularly for Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, to take a very strongly reductionist approach to humanity, saying we're just atoms and molecules. And I want to suggest to you that is very widespread within contemporary atheism, that somehow the affirmation of atheism is seem to entail the fact that we have to adopt this very, very materialist, very, very reduction account of human nature. Or, perhaps like Dawkins himself, think that our sole purpose is simply to reproduce our genes. In other words, we reduce human significance to the level of our components. Well, I want you to look at what I'm holding in my hand, which is a bottle of water. Now listen, this bottle of water is just atoms and molecules. And on the basis of this totally inadequate account of human nature, because I am allegedly just atoms and molecules, that puts me on the same level as this bottle of water. I do want to suggest that there's a lot more that needs to be said, and we're not going to get that from this kind of scientific reductionism. So what I think we need to do is say there is something about human nature that makes us want to ask these deeper questions, existential issues. In other words, not just how do things function, but why am I here? What's the purpose of life? And these are fundamental questions that human beings ask and want to have answered. And for that reason, I'm going to suggest that we need more than science. We don't just want to know how things work. We want to know something deeper. We want to know what they mean. And that's true about human nature. We can work out how human bodies work, but we need to know what we're here for and what the point of existence actually is. There's a British writer called Jeanette Winterson, and in a recent book called Why Be Happy When You Can Just Be Normal? A very interesting question. She wrote these words: we cannot simply eat, sleep, hunt, and reproduce. We are meaning-seeking creatures. I want to suggest to you that psychology would confirm that point. And here's the point I'm going to make in dealing with this. That means going beyond science. Science is about empirical observation and trying to figure out what links things together. But it doesn't mean we can traverse into morality. Look at Albert Einstein there. Science can only ascertain what is, not what should be. And outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. In other words, you can't get morality, what is good, what is bad, out of science. And this seems to me to be a really important point. There's a Spanish philosopher who writes very well on this point. Scientific truth is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. His point is, science is looking at one level, but we need something deeper. Meaning is not something empirical. Morality is not something empirical. These are about interpretations of our world. And that means, by definition, they cannot be proved to be right. And Ortega goes on to say, we're given no escape from ultimate questions. What are ultimate questions? That's a phrase Karl Popper introduced. It means questions like, what is the meaning of life? What is good? Big questions, the kind of big questions that is in the title of my lecture. We're given no escape from ultimate questions. In one way or another, they're in us, whether we like it or not. This point, look at this. Scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete. If that's right, that's Lewis's point, that's Ortega's point, it'll also be my point, then science helps us, but is inadequate and incomplete, because we are asking deeper questions which science cannot answer. No criticism of science whatsoever. Science is great, but it fills in only part of this big picture and leaves other parts untouched. Here's Richard Dawkins. Very famous quote from his book, River Out of Eden. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we expect. If there is a bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Notice the logical structure. We look at the universe and say, oh, it's just what we'd expect if there's no God, no nothing. But it's not a proof. And here's my question to Richard Dawkins. Supposing he's looking at life through a lens which is out of focus. Maybe he needs a new lens, a new way of seeing things to actually begin to discover issues like purpose, evil, good, even God. And the point I'm making is that Dawkins is looking at the world through his atheist lens. What happens if we go back to C.S. Lewis and his idea of Christianity giving you a big picture which illuminates the landscape and brings things into focus? For me, that's a very telling point. And Lewis is very hostile to any kind of reductionism. Many of you will have read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and you'll know that one of the children in the story shows off his scientific knowledge to an old man. And Eustace Scrubb here says, in our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. And the old man replies, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. We live in a world where many like Dawkins think that giving an account of human functionality or human structure is equivalent to telling us what human beings are. But it's not good enough. And that's why I think Lewis really does need to be heard very, very clearly. Lewis is very clear. We tell stories to make sense, and that's the way we're meant to live. And certainly modern anthropology has highlighted this point. Christian Smith of Notre Dame, we're animals who most fundamentally understand what reality is, who we are, how we ought to live, by locating ourselves in the larger narratives and meta-narratives that we hear and tell, and that constitute what is for us real and significant. For Lewis, Christianity tells this story that makes so much sense of our lives and helps us relate our own story to this bigger story of which we are part. And so in the case of Narnia, Lewis is saying, in effect, we have to make a decision about which story we can trust. That faith in many ways is saying, this is a true story and I fit into that story. And we need to be aware that our culture tells many stories. One of them is that we are random outcomes of a random process. We're here by accident, so why don't we just live and get on with life and not think about meaning and value and purpose? Lewis is saying there is another story that tells us a very different account of the way things are and invites us to enter into this richer vision of reality. And the point is, they can't all be right. I must begin to wrap up. Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in the 1960s, was very, very clear. He was a rationalist, but he was absolutely clear. Science has its limits. We need to acknowledge, he said, there are questions that science cannot answer and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. Lewis would agree. And the point that Medawar is making is that there are questions we rightly ask. What is the point of life? Why are we here? What is good? How do we live the good life? And if science can't answer them, then we don't say these are silly non-questions. We say, well, that's not a problem. We therefore look for answers somewhere else. There's a big picture. Science fills in part of it, but so does the Christian faith. It, in effect, gives us this added dimension of meaning, value, and purpose, engaging those deeper existential questions which matter to so many people. So I'm going to wrap up in a moment. I'm going to wrap up by looking at Alex Rosenberg's interesting book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And in this, what he does is say, here are some questions we ask, and here are the answers that science gives. I'm going to present you his own questions and answers in his own words. I'm going to say to you, I think this approach is completely inadequate. Let me see if you agree with me. Question 1, is there a God? No. Number 2, what's the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. What's the meaning of life? Ditto. Nah. This is amusing, but the next one is not amusing. It's deeply worrying. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. I don't think anybody here could live with that, because we just know that we live in a messy, screwed up world, and we need to rediscover the categories of good and bad, especially the idea of evil, to cope with what we see around us. And Alex Rosenberg may adequately describe the kind of view that Richard Dawkins develops, but you just can't live with that kind of outlook. So let me then wrap up this question of meaning. It's not an empirical question. You can't read meaning off from nature. You can't read it off like you might read somebody's temperature or the color of their eyes. It's about an interpretation. Dawkins interprets things atheistically. I interpret things in a Christian way, as does Lewis. And the key point here is, this is a judgment. It's not something that can be proved. In other words, it's a matter of faith. And as I end, I'm making this very simple point. Whether you're an atheist or a Christian, you are offering an interpretation of the world. And atheists tend to think our view is a fact, whereas these other people believe this is a matter of faith. My point is simply this. Atheists make their judgments as a matter of faith as well. And I want to suggest that they need to face up to that and embrace it. And the answer is not that atheism is factual, whereas Christianity is about faith. It's that atheism is a form of faith, Christianity is a form of faith, and the big question is, which is more reliable and which addresses those deep questions about meaning, value, and purpose that gives us that will to live, that moral framework, that sense of excitement about what life can hold. In saying, I think C.S. Lewis gets this right, or at least more so than Dawkins, the point I'm making is very, very simple. If Lewis is right, then Christianity gives us a way of looking at the world which is reasonable, which is evidenced, and above all, something that gives us an understanding of who we are, and more importantly, why we matter. And ladies and gentlemen, we need that reassurance. And in the light of our conversation between Dawkins and Lewis, I want to suggest to you that Lewis offers us the better way ahead. We take Dawkins seriously, but nevertheless, in the end, he himself cannot stand in the light of the criteria he uses to judge others, but doesn't apply to himself. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.
So, Professor McGrath, how would you help a friend who is an atheist change their mind?
Well, I think that's a very powerful point. I think one of the things I'd want to say is, look, I've been there. That's where I was once. And what happened to me was a double realization. Number one, that atheism didn't really give those robust, reliable answers to life's deepest questions. And number two, that Christianity turned out to have a much more resilient way of looking at things, a much more meaningful approach to things than I had realized. I think what I want to say is that everyone here this evening who in effect thinks about their faith, what you might like to think about is how you would help an atheist to see that actually Christianity engages reality, but also opens up these deeper questions about meaning. I think too often what Christians do is try and say, look, I think we're right. I want to say we need to go deeper than that and say we are able to engage these deeper questions about meaning in life, about the basis of morality, and be able to appreciate and rejoice in the kind of answers that Christianity gives. Lewis is a very good example of someone who does this in his book, Mere Christianity.
Okay, as I go through these, a number of these are great questions that I'll be covering Sunday morning with Professor McGrath. Plug, go to church. Because we're going to have very limited time, and I'm going to try and get through a diverse group of questions as best as I can. Where is atheism going?
Where is atheism going? My own feeling is that the new atheism is very, very aggressive, much more so than older forms of atheism. And I would read that aggressiveness as, in effect, a sign of immense frustration that, in effect, they have realized they cannot prove their core beliefs and that religion is not disappearing as the atheist worldview says it should. And I think this is a very important point to make, that if atheism is right, then religion ought to have vanished by now. It hasn't. And it's not simply an inconvenience for atheism. It's a growing realization maybe our worldview is wrong. And so I think this anger is actually really an expression of deep anxiety about why people are refusing to see what's so exciting about atheism, and perhaps that is because actually it might not be right.
Okay, that one didn't make the cut. Sorry, guys. Maybe Sunday morning. What distinguishes the interpretation of evidence by faith from the interpretation of evidence by inductive reasoning?
I think that the two are much closer than you might think. Supposing you are looking at a body of evidence using inductive processes, and what you've got to do is ask, which is the best interpretation? What criteria might you use? Well, there are four that are very often used. One is, in effect, its simplicity. One would be its elegance. Another would be its fruitfulness. Another would be its comprehensiveness. Think of number two, elegance. That's about beauty. Beauty is a judgment. It's not an objective criterion. And what I'm trying to make is that actually there's a serious debate in the philosophy of science about how you organize these, which is the hierarchy, which is top. And in effect, these are simply criteria that are used to help you make a decision. It's not as if it's written in the deep structure of the universe that you use these four criteria in this order in some kind of algorithm that gives you the answer. In the end, you make a judgment using those criteria that this theory is better. But that's a judgment, which is another way of saying, I have faith. This is the best explanation. So there's much greater overlap than you might think.
One of the things I've not told you all in the introduction, but you may know, is Professor McGrath has actually debated Richard Dawkins before. He's a fair person to say, here's my understanding of what Dawkins would or would not say. So within that framework, I'll ask this question. Dawkins' scientific reductionism has been and still remains widespread in the West, especially in the academy. Any ideas why?
Well, here I want to say two things in response to this. One is that science itself entails no philosophy whatsoever. It's about trying to understand what the best way of making sense of observations is. The kind of scientific reductionism that Dawkins espouses is not science, it's a philosophy. It's kind of a metaphysics that's been grafted into his science, and it's a materialist reductionist metaphysics. So the point I'm going to make is that actually Dawkins is here primarily speaking not as a scientist, but actually as a philosophical materialist. And I think that it's not good for science to be allied to philosophy like that. But the second point I want to make simply is this. That's what Dawkins says. There are many other scientists who would say very, very different things, saying in effect that is his interpretation of things. It is not self-evidently right. It's not the most obvious interpretation of the evidence. There is room for other interpretations. And the key point I want to make is that scientists who are Christians really do need to say there is another way of looking at things. It's this. It needs to be taken seriously.
Okay, the lightning round. Quick questions with quick answers. Did Lewis believe in the virgin birth and the Trinity?
Virgin birth, question mark, Trinity, definitely.
What is the purpose of life according to C.S. Lewis? That's hardly a lightning round question. I'm sorry.
In one word, the hope of heaven. Sorry, that's actually 3 words. Sorry, my mathematics isn't very good tonight.
From Texas,
I'm on British time.
Yeah. And from Texas, we tend to put all of that into one word. Hope of heaven. His PhD, or his DPhil, Oxford's PhD, is in molecular biophysics. And someone else remembered at least the biophysics part because they asked, what is biophysics?
It's understanding how biological structures actually work, like cell membranes.
What's your next book?
It's a book looking at rationality in science and religion, and one of the people I'll be engaging with in writing this, of course, is both C.S. Lewis and Richard Dawkins. So thank you for the preparation for the book.
Don't people usually choose their beliefs on life, in the universe and everything based on their own preferences?
I think this is a very good question. I mean, I personally think that very often people will arrive at a view as to whether there's a God or not a God, and will then interpret science in the light of that faith. I think that's an important point to make. And the point I would want to make in response to that is that science does not entail atheism. It's simply an option. And Dawkins' argument seems to be, science necessarily moves you towards atheism. Well, it doesn't. End of discussion.
Okay, and there are some great questions. I promise you I'm going to try and go through those and get to some of them Sunday morning, but we're really out of time, and so I've got 2 more lightning round questions I can ask. Well, 3. But who's counting? What is your favorite Lewis work?
Depends on the day of the week, but it's either Surprised by Joy or Mere Christianity.
Which one had the greatest impact on you?
I think probably Mere Christianity to begin with, but in later life, Surprised by Joy has come to mean more.
And last question. How, amidst your other responsibilities, did you make time to read all of these works by Lewis? Specifically, what's your schedule regime?
Well, first of all, it was a labor of love. It had to be done. I mean, you're a lawyer. First thing you do is you assess all the evidence and you lay it out, because if you don't do that, what's the point in writing about Lewis? So in effect, it's very, very important to get that done. How did I fit it in? Well, I get up early in the mornings.